The crystal champagne flutes shattered against marble as millionaire husband Marcus Chen's fist connected with his pregnant wife's ribs for the 100th time that night. At their 5th anniversary gala, while 300 guests pretended not to notice the bruises blooming beneath her designer gown, unaware that the trembling woman he was destroying carried not just his child, but a secret that would make him wish he'd shown mercy. Unaware, her father watching from the shadows wasn't just another wealthy guest, but the most powerful CEO in the nation, who'd been searching for his missing daughter for 20 years. But would Marcus realize his catastrophic mistake before her father revealed himself, or would his own arrogance blind him to the identity of the silver-haired man, now walking toward them with eyes that promised to crush everything Marcus had built forever? The Georgetown ballroom glittered like a jewelry box, 5 crystal chandeliers casting prismatic light across faces that knew the price of everything and the value of nothing. Sarah Chen pressed her hand against her stomach 6 months along, though you'd barely know it beneath the flowing emerald silk her husband had selected that morning. The fabric was expensive enough to feed a family for a year, but it couldn't hide the finger-shaped bruises on her upper arms or the way she flinched when Marcus touched her shoulder. "Smile," he hissed into her ear, his grip tightening until she felt her bones compress. "You're embarrassing me in front of the Hendersons. They're worth 40 million and you look like you're at a funeral." She smiled. She'd learned long ago that survival meant compliance. The Sarah who dreamed of becoming an architect, who'd spent hours sketching buildings that touched the sky, had died somewhere between the honeymoon and the first time Marcus had slammed her against their kitchen counter for overcooking his steak. This Sarah, the one who existed now, was smaller, quieter, more careful. Across the ballroom, a silver-haired man in an impeccably tailored suit stood motionless, his champagne glass frozen halfway to his lips. Robert Thornton, CEO of Thornton Global Industries, a man whose net worth exceeded the GDP of small nations, stared at the pregnant woman in emerald silk with an expression that made his security detail exchange worried glances. His hand trembled so violently that champagne sloshed over the rim. "Sir?" His head of security, James, stepped closer. "Are you all right?" Robert couldn't breathe. 20 years. 20 years of private investigators, dead-end leads, and nights spent clutching a photograph of a 3-year-old girl with dark curls and his wife's smile. His daughter, his Elizabeth, the child who'd vanished from a park playground while he'd been on a conference call too important to interrupt. The daughter whose disappearance had killed his wife 3 years later, her heart simply giving up from grief. The woman across the ballroom had Sarah written on her name tag, but Robert saw his Elizabeth in every line of her face. The distinctive Thornton jaw, the slight upturn of her nose that had belonged to his grandmother, and they're just visible when she turned her head, a small birthmark shaped like a crescent moon behind her left ear. He'd spent 2 decades memorizing that birthmark from photographs. "Find out everything about that couple," Robert commanded quietly, his voice carrying the steel that had built empires. "The woman in green and the man attached to her like a parasite. Everything. I want names, addresses, financial records, and I want to know why she's standing here like she's terrified." Sarah felt the weight of someone's stare and glanced up, meeting the silver-haired man's gaze across 50 feet of polished marble. Something flickered in his eyes. Recognition? Impossible. She didn't know anyone here except through Marcus's business connections, but the man was looking at her the way. Her fractured memories sometimes conjured up an image of safety, of strong arms lifting her onto broad shoulders, of a deep voice reading bedtime stories about princesses who built castles instead of waiting in them. The memory shattered as Marcus's fingers dug into her wrist. "The Vanderbilts are leaving. Go get our coats." "And Sarah?" His voice dropped to that particular register that meant pain was coming. "Walk faster. You're waddling like a cow and it's pathetic." She moved toward the coat check, her heels clicking against marble that cost more per square foot than most people earned in a month. The bathroom called to her, a moment of sanctuary, but Marcus timed her absences. 30 seconds too long meant consequences. In the marble-appointed women's lounge, she caught her reflection and barely recognized herself. The woman staring back wore a fortune in jewels, but had the eyes of someone who'd stopped believing in rescue. She touched her stomach gently, whispering promises. She wasn't sure she could keep. This baby would be different. This baby would give her a reason to finally run. That's quite a rock, a voice said behind her. An older woman with kind eyes was washing her hands, nodding towards Sarah's anniversary band 10 carats that had cost Marcus a fraction of what he'd spent on his new Tesla. Fifth anniversary, Sarah managed, her voice rusty from disuse. My husband bought me a toaster for our fifth, the woman said dryly. Of course, he also never raised his hand to me, so I suppose I got the better deal. Sarah's head snapped up. The woman met her gaze in the mirror, her expression gentle but unflinching. I volunteer at a women's shelter, she continued quietly, pulling a card from her clutch. We're always there. Always. No judgment, no questions you don't want to answer. She placed the card on the marble counter. Sometimes the most expensive prisons have the prettiest bars. Before Sarah could respond, the door burst open. Marcus stood in the doorway, his face the particular shade of red that preceded broken bones. 3 minutes, he snarled. You've been gone 3 minutes. What the hell are you doing? I was just. His hand shot out, gripping her throat. The older woman gasped, stumbling backward. Marcus's eyes were black pools of rage, the same eyes that had once recited poetry and promised her the world. You don't think, he hissed, his breath hot against her face. You don't speak to strangers. You don't embarrass me. You're a reflection of my success, and right now, you're making me look like I married defective merchandise. He released her suddenly, and she stumbled, catching herself on the counter. The older woman was already gone, probably to find help that would never come. People like Marcus were untouchable. He had lawyers, friends in politics, and the kind of money that made witnesses forget what they'd seen. We're leaving, Marcus announced, straightening his Armani tie. You've ruined another evening. I don't know why I bother trying to elevate you. Sarah followed him back into the ballroom, her throat aching, her spirit fracturing into smaller pieces. The card from the shelter woman was clutched in her palm, a fragile lifeline she didn't dare believe in. Robert Thornton watched them cross the ballroom, his jaw clenched so tight his teeth ached. James had returned with preliminary information, whispered quickly into his ear. Marcus Chen, tech entrepreneur, net worth $23 million, married 5 years to Sarah Chen, maiden name Sarah Morrison, a name that meant nothing because 20 years ago, his daughter had been taken and likely given to new parents, new papers, a new identity. But Robert knew his child. He'd known her the moment she turned her head and revealed that crescent moon birthmark. He'd known her in the curve of her cheekbone and the way she held herself, trying to be invisible, a Thornton trait when threatened, something his own, the father had done during the hostile takeover attempts of the 80s. He watched Marcus Chen grip his daughter's arm hard enough to leave marks, watched her flinch and comply, and something ancient and terrible rose up in Robert's chest. He'd built his empire on calculated risks and patient strategy, but watching his lost daughter being brutalized by a trust fund tyrant with delusions of power was testing the limits of his legendary control. James, he said softly, I need eyes on them. 24/7 surveillance. I need to know every move he makes, every transaction, every dirty secret in his closet. And I need it yesterday. Consider it done, sir. And James, keep the team close. When she needs extraction, and she will, I want us ready to move in 60 seconds. Marcus's Tesla pulled up to the valet stand. He walked ahead, leaving Sarah to navigate the marble steps alone in 4-inch heels while 6 months pregnant. She stumbled on the third step, catching herself on the brass railing. No one helped her. People like Marcus cultivated crowds that looked away. Inside the car, the real anniversary celebration began. The one where Marcus's mask dropped completely and the millionaire husband became the monster he'd always been beneath the suits and charity donations. You humiliated me, he began, his voice conversational as he pulled into traffic, disappearing into the bathroom for 3 minutes when the Vanderbilts wanted to discuss their portfolio. Do you have any idea what that costs me? Every second you're not performing your role perfectly is money out of my pocket. I'm sorry. Sarah whispered, the words automatic. Sorry? His laugh was sharp enough to draw blood. Sorry doesn't rebuild my reputation. Sorry doesn't erase the way you flinched when I touched you, making me look like some kind of wife beater in front of half of Georgetown's elite. The irony would have been funny if Sarah had any humor left. Instead, she focused on breathing, on making herself smaller in the leather seat, on protecting the baby that kicked against her ribs as if it could sense danger. You're pathetic, Marcus continued, warming to his theme the way he always did. I pulled you out of that nowhere state school, gave you a life beyond your wildest dreams, and you can't even maintain basic appearances for 5 hours. My friends are starting to ask questions. Why does your wife always look scared? Why doesn't she ever smile? Do you know what that does to my social standing? They pulled into the circular driveway of their Potomac estate, 6 bedrooms, a pool, and enough security cameras that Sarah had stopped trying to find blind spots years ago. The house that everyone envied was her prison, and Marcus held every key. 18 months after the divorce was finalized, Catherine Jo stood on the stage at the Forbes Women's Summit in Manhattan, her daughters Emma and Charlotte in the front row with her mother, and told a version of her story that was carefully edited for public consumption, but no less true in the parts that mattered. The audience of entrepreneurs and executives listened in rapt attention as she described building a multi-billion-dollar empire while maintaining complete anonymity, then making the strategic decision to step into the public eye after her divorce. She talked about the challenges of being a single mother, running a conglomerate, the importance of teaching her daughters that power wasn't something to hide or apologize for, and the freedom that came from finally living as her whole self, instead of the diminished version she'd performed for years. What she didn't mention was the satisfaction she'd felt watching her ex-husband's career implode, or the cold efficiency with which she dismantled every success she'd quietly built for him and her former best friend. Some revenges were meant to be private. Daniel Hayes was in the audience, though Catherine didn't know it until after her speech, when he approached during the networking reception, looking older than his 34 years, wearing a suit that was nice, but not the Brioni he used to prefer back when he could afford 4-figure tailoring. Catherine's security detail tensed when he got close, but she waved them off with a subtle gesture, curious despite herself about what the man she'd once loved enough to hide her empire for could possibly want to say now. He looked nervous in a way she'd never seen during their marriage. That cocky attorney, confidence completely gone, replaced by something humble and broken that would have satisfied her 18 months ago but now just made her tired. Catherine, he said, and even the way he used her first name felt presumptuous, like he was claiming a familiarity he'd forfeited when he walked out. I just wanted to say, your speech was incredible. You're incredible. I always knew you were special, but I didn't understand how special until it was too late. Catherine sipped her champagne and studied the man who'd fathered her children, trying to reconcile this diminished version with the person she'd thought she'd married back when they were broke students dreaming about the future. Daniel had landed at a mid-size firm in New Jersey after Hayes and Partners asked him to leave, taking a 60% pay cut and a position that would never lead to partnership. She knew this because Marcus still monitored Daniel's situation with the thoroughness Joe Holdings applied to all potential liabilities, though Catherine rarely asked for updates anymore. She also knew that Jessica Morrison had moved back to Ohio after Morrison Marketing collapsed under the lawsuits and debt, that the relationship between Daniel and Jessica had lasted exactly 3 months after Catherine's Wall Street Journal profile destroyed any illusions they'd had about their own importance. The poetic justice of watching them turn on each other, once the fantasy crumbled, had been satisfying for approximately 1 day before Catherine realized she didn't actually care what happened to either of them. Indifference, she discovered, was the final stage of moving on, the point where someone's suffering stopped mattering because they simply didn't matter anymore. You didn't know I was special, Catherine corrected gently, not unkindly, just stating a fact. You knew I was useful. You knew I made your life easier, but you never actually saw me, Daniel. If you had, you would have noticed that the consulting work that supposedly paid our rent was actually managing a multi-billion-dollar empire. You would have wondered why our house cost $3 million when your salary couldn't support that mortgage. You would have asked questions about where the money came from instead of just accepting that somehow everything always worked out. Daniel flinched but didn't argue, which Catherine appreciated because it suggested he'd at least achieved some self-awareness during his fall from grace. I know, he said quietly. I was arrogant and blind, and I threw away the best thing in my life because I couldn't handle not being the important one. I destroyed our family because of my ego, and I know I can never fix it or make it right or earn forgiveness. I know that, but I wanted you to know that I see it now. I understand what I lost. Catherine felt nothing at his admission, no satisfaction or vindication or even the faint echo of old feelings, just a vast neutrality that was somehow more final than anger ever could have been. The custody arrangement is working well, she said, changing the subject because Daniel's remorse wasn't her problem to absolve. Emma loves her weekends with you, and she's excited about starting kindergarten next month. Daniel's face softened at the mention of their daughter, and Catherine knew that whatever else he'd destroyed, he did genuinely love Emma and was trying to be a good father within the limited time the custody agreement allowed. She'd given him standard visitation rights every other weekend, one evening per week, not because he deserved more, but because Emma deserved a relationship with her father, even if that father had proven himself catastrophically inadequate as a husband. Charlotte he saw less frequently, the baby not old enough to handle overnight visits yet, but Catherine had agreed to supervised afternoons when Daniel's schedule permitted. She wasn't punishing her daughters for their father's failures, even if she'd absolutely punished their father for those same failures. Thank you for that, Daniel said, and Catherine heard genuine gratitude in his voice, the acknowledgement that she could have made the custody situation much worse and had chosen not to. I know I don't have the right to ask for anything, but Emma mentioned you're seeing someone. Marcus Chen, your CFO? The question hung between them, simultaneously intrusive and understandable. The awkward navigation of ex-spouses trying to figure out appropriate boundaries. Catherine smiled slightly, thinking about Marcus, who'd known her secret from the beginning, who'd helped build Joe Holdings from a struggling startup to a multi-billion-dollar empire, who'd waited patiently for 5 years while she was married to someone else, and had been there the night Daniel left. Not saying I told you so, even though he'd earned the right to say it. I am, she confirmed, offering no details because her personal life was no longer Daniel's business. He's wonderful with the girls. Emma adores him. She watched Daniel process this information, saw him calculate whether he had any right to be jealous or hurt, watched him decide correctly that he had forfeited all claims to opinions about her romantic life when he'd abandoned her while pregnant. Marcus appeared then, moving through the crowd with the easy confidence of someone who knew exactly who he was and didn't need to prove it to anyone, and Catherine felt herself relax in a way she never had during her entire marriage to Daniel. Marcus was her intellectual equal, her partner in building something meaningful, and he'd loved her when she was powerful and visible instead of needing her to be small and hidden. He nodded politely to Daniel. They'd met during the divorce proceedings, awkward encounters, where Daniel had clearly been measuring himself against Catherine's new relationship and finding himself wanting, and handed Catherine a glass of water along with her phone. Your mother just sent photos, he said. Charlotte managed to get applesauce in her hair again. Emma thinks it's hilarious. Catherine looked at the photos, her baby daughter grinning gap-toothed and covered in food, Emma laughing beside her, and felt that fierce, maternal love that had driven every decision she'd made for the past 5 years. This was what mattered, not revenge or vindication, or watching ex-husbands realize what they'd lost, but building a life where her daughters would grow up knowing they could be powerful without apology, successful without permission, and whole without needing to diminish themselves for someone else's ego. Daniel excused himself shortly after, disappearing into the crowd, and Catherine watched him go with that same vast neutrality, noting absently that this might be the last time they'd have a conversation that wasn't about custody schedules or Emma's school events. Marcus slipped an arm around her waist, careful not to wrinkle the Armani dress she was wearing, the first designer clothes she'd worn publicly in years, no longer hiding behind Target jeans and the costume of suburban normalcy. "How do you feel?" he asked, and Catherine considered the question seriously, taking inventory of her emotional state the way she'd analyze a quarterly earnings report. "Free," she said finally, and realized it was true. The woman who'd hidden her empire to preserve a marriage was gone, replaced by someone who'd learned that the only relationship worth having was one where you could be fully yourself. The abandoned pregnant wife who'd been devastated 18 months ago had transformed into Catherine Zhou, CEO and single mother and woman, who'd turned her pain into power and her betrayal into freedom. 6 months later, Catherine sat in the Connecticut estate. She'd kept the house, though she'd renovated extensively, erasing the memories and rebuilding it into something that felt like hers alone, reading Emma a bedtime story while Charlotte dozed in her crib nearby. Emma, now 5 and starting to understand that her mother was someone important in ways that extended beyond their home, asked the question Catherine had been expecting for months. "Mama, why did Daddy leave us?" Catherine set the plain book down and pulled her daughter close, choosing her words carefully because Emma deserved honesty without burden, truth without trauma. "Sometimes grown-ups make mistakes," she said. "Daddy made a mistake because he didn't understand how special our family was. But that mistake doesn't mean you're not loved, and it doesn't mean our family isn't complete. We have each other, and Grandma, and Marcus, and so many people who love you. That's what makes a family, not who leaves, but who stays." Emma seemed satisfied with this answer, at least for now, and Catherine knew there would be harder conversations ahead as her daughters got older. Questions about why their father only saw them every other weekend, why he lived in a small apartment instead of a house like theirs, why their mother's last name was Zhou and their last name was Hayes. But she'd handle those conversations the same way she'd handled everything else, with honesty tempered by compassion, with strength that didn't require cruelty, with the certain knowledge that her daughters would grow up understanding their worth because she'd never hidden her own. The multi-billion-dollar empire that had once been a secret was now a legacy she was building for Emma and Charlotte, a foundation they could stand on instead of a truth they'd discover too late. And if Daniel spent the rest of his life regretting what he'd thrown away, if Jessica lived with the knowledge that she'd destroyed a 20-year friendship for a man who'd left her the moment their fantasy collapsed, if both of them occasionally wondered what their lives would have looked like if they hadn't been so spectacularly stupid, well, that was a devastation they'd earned, and Catherine had stopped caring about their suffering the moment she'd realized her own happiness didn't require their misery. She'd won not by destroying them, though she had, but by building something so much bigger and better that their betrayal had become merely a footnote in a much larger story. The brief chapter where she'd learned that the only person worth hiding for was yourself, and even then, only when visibility served no purpose. Now visibility served every purpose, and Catherine Zhou was done hiding.